Colonel Ríceard Kemp, thank you so much for granting us with this interview.
My pleasure.
Only this week, the London court has decided to release Sergeant Alexander Blackman, that was convicted in murdering or killing a Taliban terrorist. What is your take on it, and how do you link it to the story of El Azaria, the soldier who shot a terrorist in Hebron?
Well, I think it's extremely good news that the court has finally come to its senses and decided that Sergeant Blackman is not guilty of murder, which he never was, but is in fact guilty of manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, which stems from his psychological conditions. He was the first British soldier in history that's ever been convicted of murder on the battlefield. And I think it reflects our society today, where very few people who are making the decisions about prosecutions, about judgment, etc., have actually experienced warfare, and they don't really understand the stresses that soldiers are under. In terms of relating it to your soldier that was convicted of manslaughter also, I haven't followed that case in great detail, but I'm sure there are similar pressures on an Israeli soldier working in the West Bank, where he'd probably seen his comrades killed or seriously wounded, attacked, living under a constant state of stress, as indeed Sergeant Blackman was in Afghanistan. I think we have to remember that. These are not people, these are not drug dealers who go out and stick a knife in somebody who owes them some money. These are soldiers who are trying their best to defend their country in very, very difficult circumstances.
Yes. Do you think that the liberal democracies of our days should change the way that they're acting in the battlefield regarding all the recent threats of terror, Islamic terror?
I think it's extremely hard for soldiers today because often they fight with one and sometimes both hands tied behind their back, whereas their enemy deliberately use their civilian population, their own civilian populations, as human shields. They want to lure British soldiers, American soldiers, Israeli soldiers to kill their own civilians. Yet our soldiers, of course, Israeli soldiers, British soldiers, adhere to the laws of armed conflict. And that puts them at a really big disadvantage. And one of the problems is that countries are unwilling, Western countries are unwilling to inflict civilian casualties. Now, it's a horrible thing to say that we need to do that, but if you're fighting an enemy that is using civilians as a human shield, if you want to beat that enemy, you've got no choice other than to inflict civilian casualties, much as you don't want to.
Yeah, so it brings me to the question, how will we be able to win this kind of war?
Well, I think we have to have a greater will to defeat the enemy. And I think this is an area where Western nations such as Britain and the United States can learn from Israel, because I believe Israel still does have that will, as it exhibited in the last Gaza conflict. I was here, I saw the last Gaza conflict. I spoke to soldiers on the ground, I observed what they were doing, I spoke to generals and politicians, and they had very clear will to defeat Hamas. The goal in the defeat of Hamas was not the annihilation of Hamas, for what I believe are very good political reasons, but was imposing enough damage on Hamas that they would want to stop fighting.
And if you were talking about the operation in Gaza, you know, only last week the US Army was bombing in Iraq, causing many casualties. Hundreds of civilians died there. Yet again, I don't really see the media covering it. Whenever there's an operation in Israel, in Gaza, anything happening in Israel, it will always be in the headlines. What is your take on it?
If Israel does something, it's automatically a war criminal. If America or Britain does something, then people have much more sympathy, people have more understanding. And what it basically comes down to is a huge anti-Israel bias in the media and among many bodies. You look at the United Nations. I mean, fortunately, the United Nations, I think, with the new Secretary General, appears to have a more realistic perspective. But let's not forget the track record of the United Nations, which has introduced countless more resolutions against Israel than against all other countries combined. So if you look at the organisations like that, the EU is equally anti-Israel. This is the reason for it. It's not rational, it's not logical, it's not comparing like with like. It's comparing what all other Western countries do to what Israel does.
Yes. Last week, a British police officer was murdered in a car ramming attack in Westminster in London. He was unarmed. Do you think that England and other European countries should change their policies about carrying weapons, about their policemen carrying weapons?
In my view, with the current threat, the constant and increasing threat of the Islamic State and other Islamic terrorists who can strike and attack at any time with very little anyone can do about it, except on the ground. And by not giving every police officer a weapon, as they have here in Israel, of course, I think it's a huge disadvantage, which won't just result in police dying, it will also result in civilians who they should be protecting dying.
I would like to take you back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why do you think the media is covering it in such a one-sided way?
Well, I think it goes back many years now, and Israel for many years has been subject to the greatest slur campaign in the history of the human race. And it's been built up, it's been financed by, particularly by Arab countries. Left-wing organisations in many Western countries have jumped on board, and it's simply slurring and distorting the reality of the situation. And one example of that is, I think, the way that Israel is condemned for its so-called occupation and its so-called illegal settlements in the West Bank. Many countries are saying, well, if Israel, for example, ceased to occupy so-called the West Bank or ceased to have settlements there, then that would bring peace. It won't bring peace. All that the Palestinians want is the annihilation of Israel. The Palestinian leadership does not want a two-state solution, which includes Israel in that equation. Now, people cannot understand that. They think that, you know, the Palestinian leadership, because they go to the UN and say so, they want peace. They don't want peace. They're educating their children to hate Israel. Generation after generation after generation are being educated in that way. Until that changes, until their attitude changes, there will not be peace. And it's high time the Western world understood that and understood the reality so that they can treat Israel for what it is, which is the one and only strong liberal democracy in the Middle East.
Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you so much for this interview.
My pleasure, thank you.